The date is late 1943. The location is not a battlefield in Europe, but a dusty railroad siding in rural Texas. A steam train grinds to a halt. The doors of the cattle cars slide open. Out steps a regiment of men. They are tanned, fit, and disciplined. They are wearing the distinctive tropical uniforms of the Afrika Korps. They are the elite soldiers of General Erwin Rommel. But they are not invaders. They are prisoners. Following the collapse of the German Axis in North Africa, the Allies found themselves with a logistical nightmare. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. Britain could not feed them. The island was already starving, under blockade by U-boats. So the decision was made to ship them to the one place on Earth with surplus food and space, the United States of America. By the end of 1943, there are over 150,000 German POWs on American soil. They are housed in more than 500 camps scattered across the South and the Midwest. Places like Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Gruber in Oklahoma, and Camp Concordia in Kansas. For the local American civilians, this is a surreal moment. Many of these towns have sent their sons to fight Nazis in Europe. Now they look out their kitchen windows and see Nazis harvesting cotton in their backyards. But what shocks the Americans is not the prisoners' behavior, it is their treatment. As Christmas approaches in 1943, a strange reality begins to settle over the camps. The prisoners are gaining weight, they are playing soccer, they are forming orchestras. And while the American guards standing outside the wire are eating Spam and worrying about ration coupons, the prisoners inside are preparing for a feast that rivals the finest hotels in Berlin. This phenomenon would come to be known by the Americans with bitter sarcasm as the Fritz Ritz.
To understand why the enemy was eating better than the guards, you must look at the law, specifically the Geneva Convention of 1929. The United States War Department was obsessed with following this treaty to the letter. Their logic was strategic. If the U.S. treats German prisoners perfectly, the Germans might treat American prisoners perfectly. Article 11 of the Convention states, "The food ration of prisoners of war shall be equivalent in quantity and quality to that of the depot troops." This legalese created a bizarre loophole. Depot troops referred to U.S. soldiers stationed at base training camps. The standard daily caloric intake for a U.S. soldier in 1943 was roughly 4,000 calories. It included massive amounts of beef, butter, milk, and sugar. Therefore, by law, the German prisoners had to be fed 4,000 calories a day. The camp commanders had no choice. If they cut the rations, they violated the treaty. So the supply trucks rolled in. Every day, German mess sergeants received sides of beef, dozens of crates of eggs, gallons of whole milk, and fresh vegetables. Contrast this with the civilian population outside the fence. In 1943, the U.S. home front is under strict rationing. Civilians are using ration books, red points for meat and fats, blue points for processed foods. Sugar is limited to 8 ounces per person per week. Coffee is restricted. Butter is almost non-existent in civilian grocery stores. Most families use oleomargarine. A steak dinner is a rare luxury. Inside the camp, the German prisoners were complaining if the steak is too tough. One guard at Camp Hearn recorded in his diary that the prisoners were discarding the crusts of their white bread that American civilians would have waited in line for. The disparity was mathematical, legal, and absolutely infuriating to the men guarding the fence.
While the prisoners were enjoying beer and symphonies, a brutal shadow war was being fought inside the barracks. The American public assumed that all German prisoners were the same. They were not. The camps were divided into 2 violent factions, the anti-Nazis, mostly draftees or older soldiers, and the hardcore Nazis, the Afrika Korps and U-boat crews. The Americans made a critical error in 1943. They allowed the prisoners to govern themselves inside the wire. They let the ranking German non-commissioned officers, or NCOs, run the barracks discipline. This effectively handed control of the camps over to the SS and the Gestapo diehards. These hardcore loyalists enforced a reign of terror inside American camps. They set up kangaroo courts. They enforced loyalty to Hitler. They monitored the mail of other prisoners. If a prisoner was heard criticizing the Führer, or if he was too friendly with the American guards, he would receive a visit in the middle of the night. The other prisoners called these enforcers the Holy Ghost because they arrived silently and left no trace. The violence was forensic and brutal. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, a prisoner named Johannes Kunz was suspected of passing information to American intelligence. On November 4, 1943, a court of German NCOs found him guilty of treason. That night, dozens of prisoners beat him to death with milk bottles filled with sand. When American guards found the body the next morning, the camp went silent. No one saw anything, no one heard anything. This was the paradox of the Fritz Ritz. On the surface, it was a holiday camp with chocolate and soccer. But beneath the surface, it was a miniature totalitarian state operating on U.S. soil. The Americans were feeding them 4,000 calories a day, and the Nazi leadership was using that energy to terrorize their own men into remaining loyal to a losing war.
The luxury did not stop at the mess hall. It extended to the wallet. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be paid for their labor. The majority of German POWs in Texas and the South were put to work in agriculture. The shortage of American farm labor, because the men were at war, meant that cotton and peanut crops were rotting in the fields. The Germans saved the harvest. They worked hard, they were disciplined, and they were paid. A prisoner earned 80 cents a day in canteen coupons, scrip. This sounds low, but in 1943, 80 cents had significant buying power, especially when room and board were free. Inside the camp, there was a PX, post exchange, a canteen store. Because these were military installations, the PX was stocked with goods that were unavailable in civilian towns. The German prisoners could walk into their canteen and buy Hershey's chocolate, Coca-Cola, tobacco, toiletries, and, most controversially, beer. At Camp Hearn, the prisoners could buy 3.2 beer. They drank it openly in their beer gardens. Civilian observers were stunned to see enemy soldiers relaxing in the Texas sun, smoking American cigarettes, drinking American beer, and eating chocolate bars that American children couldn't get. The camp economy became so robust that prisoners began to pool their money to buy instruments. They bought violins, pianos, and brass horns from mail-order catalogs. They built stage sets. They produced full-scale theatrical plays and concerts. By December 1943, the camps were not prisons. They were functioning, self-sufficient German towns transplanting the culture of Bavaria to the plains of Texas. Shift perspective now to the perimeter fence. The men guarding these camps were often not combat troops. Combat troops were needed in Italy and the Pacific. The guards were often Category C personnel, older men, men with medical disabilities, or soldiers recovering from wounds. Private First Class Jim Miller, a composite representative of the guards, stands in a guard tower. It is December. It is cold. He is wearing a standard-issue field jacket. His dinner in the mess hall was SOS, creamed chipped beef on toast, or Spam. He has not had a fresh egg in 2 weeks. He receives letters from his wife saying she can't get sugar to make a cake for their son's birthday. He looks down into the compound. He sees the Germans. They look healthy. Their uniforms are pressed. They have their own laundry service. He smells roasting turkey. He hears them singing. He watches them buying beer. The psychological toll on the guards was immense. There are reports of guards shouting insults at the prisoners, not out of war hatred, but out of economic jealousy. Some guards were caught smuggling items out of the prison canteen to give to their families, a reversal of the usual prison dynamic where items are smuggled in. The resentment grew so high that the War Department had to issue propaganda pamphlets to the guards, explaining that fattening up the Germans was a way to show the superiority of the American system. The guards didn't buy it. To them, it looked like the losers were winning. The tension at the fence line wasn't just about food, it was about women. With millions of American men deployed overseas, the workforce in the rural towns surrounding these camps was predominantly female.
Women worked in the factories, the canneries, and on the farms where the prisoners were sent to harvest crops. Inevitably, human nature took over. Despite strict non-fraternization rules, relationships formed. The German prisoners were often young, fit, tanned from working outside, and polite. To some local women, they seemed less like monsters and more like lonely boys far from home. Scandals began to erupt across the Midwest. At Camp Holton in Maine, local farmers admitted they preferred German POWs to local labor because the Germans were cleaner and worked harder. They would often invite the prisoners into the farmhouse for lunch, sitting them at the family table, a direct violation of Army regulations. But the situation became criminal in several documented cases. At Camp Hearn, guards reported finding love letters passed through the laundry service. In one infamous incident, 2 German prisoners escaped from a camp in Minnesota not to flee the country, but to meet 2 local girls they had met while working in a canning factory. They were caught sharing a picnic in the woods. The government panic was palpable. The FBI was called in to investigate un-American activities involving local women. There was a fear that these romances would lead to sabotage, but in reality, it was a sociological phenomenon. The enemy was charming. A popular joke circulating in 1943 went, "My heart belongs to Daddy, but my feet belong to Fritz." This infuriated the American soldiers guarding the towers, who were forbidden from even speaking to the local girls while on duty, while the prisoners were blowing kisses from the truck beds. December 24, 1943, the Fritz Ritz reaches its peak. Inside Camp Hearn, the preparations for Heiligabend, Christmas Eve, have been underway for weeks. Using their labor money, the prisoners have purchased colored paper, tinfoil, and cotton batting from the PX. They have transformed the drab wooden barracks. They have built elaborate nativity scenes. They have taken cigarette pack foil and turned it into tinsel. They have harvested local cedar trees to serve as Tannenbaums. But the centerpiece is the food. The menu for Christmas dinner at the German POW camps in 1943 is a matter of public record. It is staggering. The U.S. Army quartermaster provided roast turkey with oyster dressing, giblet gravy, candied sweet potatoes, buttered peas, celery and olives, hot rolls with butter, pumpkin pie with whipped cream, coffee, cigarettes, candy, and nuts. In addition to this official ration, the prisoners used their own funds to bake thousands of German pastries, Stollen and Lebkuchen, using flour and sugar stockpiled from the mess hall. At 1800 hours, the feast begins. The German camp orchestra plays. The prisoners sing Stille Nacht, Silent Night, and O Tannenbaum. The camp commander, an American colonel, often attends the dinner as a guest of honor. He sits at the head table with the ranking German officer. They exchange toasts. Outside the wire, the local town of Hearn, Texas, is quiet. Families are sitting down to modest dinners, a meatloaf extended with breadcrumbs, vegetables from a victory garden, a pie made with molasses because there is no sugar. They can hear the brass band playing inside the camp. The irony is absolute. The enemy is having the best Christmas in the county. While the Army prisoners were content to eat turkey and wait out the war, the naval prisoners were different, specifically the U-boat crews. These men were technically highly trained, fanatically loyal, and obsessed with returning to the Atlantic. The U.S. Navy, recognizing this danger, segregated the most dangerous U-boat commanders at a specialized camp, Camp Papago in Arizona. This leads to the legendary Great Papago Escape, which took place exactly 1 year after the famous 1943 Christmas feast. The camp contained the super aces of the U-boat fleet, including Jürgen Wattenberg, commander of U-162. They did not spend their time baking cookies. They spent it digging. The soil in Arizona was hard, rocky, caliche. It was impossible to tunnel through without heavy tools, but the U-boat men were engineers. They noticed a blind spot near the bathhouse. Over the course of months, they dug a tunnel 178 feet long. They flushed the dirt down the toilets, dissolving it with water. On December 23, 1944, just in time for Christmas, 25 German naval officers and sailors crawled through the mud and vanished into the Arizona desert. Their plan was audacious. They intended to build a raft and float down the Salt River to Mexico. What they didn't know, because their maps were old, was that the Salt River was dry. It was just a bed of rocks. The escape sparked the largest manhunt in Arizona history.
But the capture of these men revealed the bizarre nature of the POW experience. They weren't caught robbing banks or sabotaging bridges. Some were caught sneaking into Phoenix to have a beer. Others surrendered simply because they were cold and hungry and missed the camp food. When Captain Wattenberg finally surrendered, the last to be caught, he walked into a Phoenix hotel lobby, ordered a meal, and then asked the waitress to call the police. He had proven his point. He could escape if he wanted to, but he ultimately realized that a prison camp in America with 3 square meals was better than being free in a desert with nothing.
There was, however, a hidden agenda behind this generosity. The U.S. government was not just being nice. This was a calculated psychological operation. Most of these German soldiers had been told by Goebbels' propaganda that America was weak, corrupt, and starving. They were told that New York City was in ruins. They were told the U.S. economy had collapsed. By feeding them 4,000 calories a day, the U.S. was destroying that narrative without firing a shot. When a German prisoner sat down to a plate of roast turkey and oyster dressing, he was forced to confront a terrifying reality. If the Americans can feed their prisoners like this, imagine how well they are feeding their soldiers. If they have this much surplus food to waste on us, they must have infinite resources. The propaganda of plenty worked. Many prisoners wrote letters home to Germany, which were censored, read by intelligence, but allowed to pass. They wrote, "Mother, I am eating meat every day. We have chocolate. Do not believe what the party tells you. America is rich." These letters filtered back to German cities that were being bombed and starved. They eroded the morale on the German home front. The Fritz Ritz was a weapon. It was a calorie bomb designed to break the enemy's will to fight.
While the public debated the morality of the Fritz Ritz, the U.S. government launched a secret program inside the camps. It was codenamed the Special Projects Division. The goal was unprecedented: to deprogram the Nazi mind. They didn't use torture, they used intellect. The War Department realized that simply defeating Germany on the battlefield was not enough. If these 300,000 men returned home still believing in Hitler, World War III would start in 10 years. So, they decided to turn the POW camps into schools for democracy. They began by identifying the anti-Nazi prisoners and secretly putting them in charge of the camp newspapers. They flooded the camps with books, not propaganda, but American literature: Hemingway, Steinbeck, Jefferson. They screened movies, but instead of war movies, they showed films like Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, films that showed Americans criticizing their own government. This confused the German prisoners. Under Hitler, criticizing the government was treason. In America, it was entertainment. The program was subtle. They introduced discussion groups. Prisoners were encouraged to debate politics openly. At first, the hardcore Nazis tried to shut these down, but the lure of intellectual freedom was too strong. By 1945, the Special Projects Division had created a massive shift in camp culture. They began publishing a national POW newspaper called Der Ruf, The Call. It was written by German prisoners, for German prisoners, but it promoted democratic ideals. When these men eventually returned to Germany to rebuild their country, many of the leaders of the new West German Republic were men who had learned how to vote inside a prison camp in Louisiana.
The party lasted through 1943 and most of 1944, but in 1945, the mood shifted violently. As the Allied armies pushed into Germany, they began to liberate the concentration camps: Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The photos and newsreels reached America in April and May of 1945. The American public saw the piles of skeletal bodies. They saw the emaciated survivors. And then they looked at the fat, tanned German prisoners playing soccer in Texas. The outrage was instantaneous and explosive. Newspaper editorials demanded an end to the coddling. Senators gave furious speeches. The civilian population threatened to riot at the camp gates. The War Department reacted immediately. The Fritz Ritz was closed. The ration policy was changed overnight. The 4,000-calorie diet was slashed. Meat was removed from the menu. The canteen privileges were revoked. Beer was banned. The good life was over.
The prisoners were put on a subsistence diet, enough to keep them alive, but not enough to make them happy. They were forced to watch newsreels of the concentration camps.
The end of the good life in 1945 involved one final mandatory requirement: the atrocity films. Before any prisoner could be repatriated to Germany, he had to watch. The U.S. Army set up projectors in the mess halls. They locked the doors. They played the raw footage filmed by the liberators at Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen. Bulldozers pushing bodies, gas chambers, the walking skeletons. For the vast majority of the Wehrmacht soldiers in these camps, this was new information. They knew the regime was brutal, but few knew the industrial scale of the Holocaust. The reaction in the American camps was mixed. Some prisoners wept openly. They burned their uniforms. Others refused to believe it. They claimed it was Hollywood trickery. The Americans made plastic bodies. At Camp Butner in North Carolina, after the film ended, a group of German prisoners voluntarily took up a collection. They gathered their remaining canteen money and donated it to the Red Cross to help the survivors of the camps. It was the moment the good life truly ended. The illusion of the noble war was shattered. They weren't just soldiers who had lost a fair fight. They were accomplices to a crime. The steak dinners and the beer gardens were gone. All that was left was the shame. The camps were emptied in 1946. The prisoners were shipped back to a shattered Germany. But the legacy of the Christmas of 1943 remained. Many of the former prisoners, once they rebuilt their lives in Germany, looked back on their time in Texas with a strange fondness. They remembered the white bread. They remembered the beer. Crucially, thousands of them immigrated back to the United States in the 1950s. They brought their families. They became American citizens. They reasoned that a country that treated its enemies with such overwhelming generosity was a country worth living in. In towns like Hearne, Texas, you can still find the concrete foundations of the camp. If you dig in the dirt, you might find a rusted harmonica reed or a bottle cap from a 1943 Coca-Cola. Relics of a strange moment in history, a moment when the wires of war got crossed, when the guards stood in the cold and the prisoners sang by the fire, when the most dangerous men in the world sat down to a turkey dinner in the heart of Texas.